Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Thursday, March 20th, day 531 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military reporter, Emmanuel Fabian. Hi, Manny. Thanks for joining me today.
Amanda.
IDF ground forces have re-entered some areas of the Gaza Strip as airstrikes have continued during this renewal of intensive fighting. Manny will explain what is happening on the ground, and we'll get more of a sense of perhaps the goals of this renewed fighting. We'll also hear what is happening with the Houthis and take a deep dive into two more IDF probes into the failures of October 7th. All this and more when we're back. As of yesterday, there are reports that the IDF has retaken half of the Netzarim Corridor, which is a new thoroughfare that bisects the width of the Gaza Strip. On Wednesday as well, the IDF said it was conducting, quote, pinpoint ground operations in the central and southern Gaza Strip. So, Manny, what are you hearing about overnight strikes, first of all?
So the army has continued these strikes since launching this new operation a couple of days ago. And we don't have an update yet as to what was targeted specifically overnight, but in general, the army has said it's been targeting mid-level Hamas military commanders, so members of the terror group's military wing, not the top commanders. There's risks in carrying that out, and right now this is the stage that Israel wants to be at. So it's the mid-level commanders and then top officials in the terror group's government, in the political bureau of the terror group. And we've seen in the last few days, Hamas has confirmed already 4. The army has named 6 members of Hamas's Politburo who were killed in strikes. The army said it's targeted Hamas company commanders and battalion commanders. It hasn't confirmed exact names yet. We'll probably find out in the coming days. They take time for Israel to confirm the intelligence in those cases. And additionally, there's been strikes targeting Hamas infrastructure, weapon depots, rocket launching positions, and other sites. So that's mainly been the targets in the last few days. I'll add that the army's also been targeting the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We've seen several strikes targeting their infrastructure and members as well. We saw Islamic Jihad announce the death of its spokesperson, Abu Hamza. He's been in the position for many, many years. Israel hasn't announced officially targeting him yet, but it's safe to say that he was indeed targeted by Israel if he was killed in one of these strikes. It wasn't a random strike or anything. It was on his home in central Gaza.
Before we move into any kind of ground incursion, I want to just ask you a few questions about the targeting. So the IDF and Israel in general considers Hamas as one terror group, meaning the political side and the military side are all targets. Is that correct, Manny?
Yeah, since day one, really day one of the war, I remember a press statement by IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari. I think it was on October 9th, so 2 days after the beginning of the war. And he said that everything related to Hamas is, quote, doomed. The political officials, the military officials, everyone, they are all targets. It's a terror organization. It's not another country where there's a separation between a military and the political side of things. Everyone is a target, and we've seen throughout the war, the Hamas political bureau, majority of the members on it have already been killed. So the officials we saw killed in the last few days are the replacements, and some of them are the replacements of the replacements already of these positions in Hamas's government. We saw the de facto prime minister being killed a day ago, and he replaced one who was killed in July 24. Regarding the ground operation...
Wait, before you move into that, Manny, I have one more question about the airstrikes, and that is this. The IDF is now conducting new airstrikes on weapons depot and also missile manufacturing. Is that what you said? I'm just so surprised that there's any of this left after these 17 months of war.
I think we've seen in the ceasefire, Hamas try to gear itself up for renewed combat. So there are now new positions that Hamas has established, new rocket launching sites, manufacturing sites. I'm not too sure about that, but there are definitely places where Hamas has, regathered its weapons, put them in one area, rebuilt the rocket launching sites, all under with the ceasefire and Israel not being able to target it during the ceasefire. Israel announced when it launched these strikes that it had intelligence that Hamas was planning to carry out some kind of attack on Israel against troops in the buffer zone or in Israel itself, something relatively major. So all these preparations that Hamas was making during the ceasefire are now being targeted by Israel. Hamas definitely used its time the last couple months of the ceasefire to prepare all this, to prepare for renewed combat. We saw many strikes before this major operation targeting Hamas members trying to plant bombs in the ground near troops. So it's definitely Israel had intelligence on other sites that were being prepared during this time.
Okay, so now let's move into what is happening on the ground. And you reported yesterday that a Golani brigade was called up or at least deployed to the southern Gaza Strip, as well as IDF retaking, essentially, the Netzarim Corridor. Is this what you know so far?
So the army has retaken around half of the Netzarim Corridor, so up to the Salah ad-Din road. That's the road where, during the ceasefire, Palestinians were able to return to North Gaza and go through this inspection at this checkpoint on the Salah ad-Din road. And it's also where the army used to have a military base. That's where I visited, actually, right before the ceasefire, this base on Salah ad-Din. So the IDF has taken half of it. It hasn't pushed all the way to the sea yet. And right now, that's basically where we are. So that means that Palestinians won't be able to return to North Gaza because the army will be there to block them. And in the south, the Golani Brigade is deployed to the border. And the army said that they are preparing for potential future actions in Gaza. What we're seeing is basically a sort of a staged operation against Hamas, where Israel is slowly ramping up the heat. So it began with these big airstrikes during the night, the surprise operation, and then Israel waited about a day and then launched this sort of minor ground operation where troops have entered Gaza, retaken half of Netzarim, have another brigade deployed to the border preparing for future action. And the goal of all of this is to, as far as I understand, is to try and pressure Hamas back into a ceasefire deal, a hostage deal, to release the hostages. Israel isn't going in with full speed yet. It's sort of ramping it up slowly, and I think that if we see Hamas not agreeing to release the hostages, then we'll see Israel ramp it up further. Troops may capture the rest of the Netzarim corridor, and then begin, as Defense Minister Israel Katz has said, to issue evacuation orders. So that could mean the entire north of Gaza, again, like we saw at the beginning of the war, where Israel evacuated the entire north of Gaza. We could see troops like the Golani Brigade push into southern Gaza, should Israel choose to activate those next steps. And I think slowly we'll see Israel ramp it up until either Hamas agrees to return to a hostage deal, or agree to a deal that Israel's happy with at least, or alternatively, Israel will go back to war. Right now, we're not back at war. We're sort of back to fighting, but we're not back at the war yet. Alternatively, we could see Israel go back to war, send in many troops into Gaza, recapture the area, and go all out. The problem with that is that it risks the lives of the hostages, and this is something that Israel knows, but it's reached the point where Israel thinks that it's either reach a deal with Hamas, and if you can't reach a deal with Hamas, then we have to go all in and destroy Hamas, even at the risk of the hostages. I will note that the military is saying that its airstrikes in Gaza, the initial wave of strikes and the other ones in the last couple of days, have taken into account the hostages. So Israel is not going to target areas where they suspect hostages are, and is updating the families of the hostages as well to let them know and tell them what's going on in the developments. And that's my assessment is that's why Israel isn't targeting the senior Hamas military commanders, under the assumption that they may be surrounding themselves with hostages. It's something that we've seen throughout the war until now. So that's why those commanders haven't been targeted yet under that assumption.
Let's turn to the Houthis. And last night, the Houthi rebels apparently fired at Israel a second ballistic missile for this week. They issued a statement claiming responsibility for the missile fired at Israel overnight, saying the Palestine 2 projectile targeted Ben Gurion Airport. So, Manny, as I said, this is the second missile this week, but neither of them have actually reached Israel proper, and there's been no actual destruction as far as I have understood it.
Yeah, both missiles have been successfully intercepted by the long-range arrow air defense system. If you want to know specifically where, they were shot down somewhere over Saudi Arabia. So when the missile's heading toward Israel, Israel can detect it, activate sirens, and then an arrow missile is launched to intercept it. Usually not over Israel itself. Sometimes the shrapnel can continue falling and actually reach Israel. But in these cases, they were both of them were intercepted relatively far from Israel, over Saudi Arabia, at a very great height, of course. The arrow missile intercepts missiles outside of the atmosphere. And there was no reports of any shrapnel falling towards Israel, no reports of damage or any direct injury. Some people were lightly hurt after falling over while running to shelter, of course. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis, maybe even millions of Israelis, were sent to shelters overnight, with sirens activating from Jerusalem all the way to Tel Aviv and across that entire area.
Right. And that in itself, and the statement that they're targeting Ben Gurion Airport, is, of course, another layer of the terrorist activity that the Houthis have been acting on since the beginning of the war with Gaza. But we're hearing as well that they're upping their attacks on U.S. ships. USS Harry Truman, I believe, has, at least reportedly, at least according to the Houthis, suffered some, 4 or 5 attacks. And there were attacks in Yemen. According to the reports that I saw, I didn't see who actually did the attacks on the ground or airstrikes into the ground of Yemen. Do you know who completed these airstrikes, Manny?
As far as I understand, it was the US, their ongoing campaign against the Houthis, and not Israeli airstrikes. We haven't yet seen Israel retaliate to these 2 missile attacks. Israel might, it had done in the past, several waves of strikes in Yemen in response to Houthi missile attacks, but it might not, because the US is currently carrying out an ongoing operation against the Houthis. They might not want Israel to get involved at this stage, but there could be coordination, and there could be a joint strike carried out against the Houthis in retaliation to these missile attacks. We'll have to wait and see what happens on that front.
We'll go to a short break. And we're back. Yesterday, the IDF presented its probe into the battle at Kibbutz Alumim, which is the latest in its detailed investigations of some 40 battles that took place during Hamas's October 7th attack, when some 5,600 terrorists stormed across the border, massacring 1,200 and taking 251 hostages to Gaza. So the probe, as in all the other probes, has highlighted the heroism of the local defense security team. And in this case, they fought for over 8 hours. Now, some 100 terrorists reached Alumim, and in all, 57 civilians and 5 members of the security forces were killed around Alumim that day. 5 hostages were taken to Gaza, and 1 unidentified foreign national was also killed at the scene, and until today, no one knows who he was. So, Manny, it seems to me in reading your report yesterday on the probe, the big difference here is that according to the investigations, the paratroopers came and actually did cause a turning point in the battle that day. Would you agree that that was the one big difference in this particular battle?
There were 2 big parts of this story that sort of changed the outcome and prevented much larger massacres. One is the local security team, like you mentioned, the Civil Defense Squad, who fought very bravely for over 8 hours straight in a few areas of Alumim, running from scene to scene, and really a heroic battle. None of those Civil Defense Squad members were killed. 4 were wounded in one of the battles, but really, really brave fighting that we saw from the investigation. And then the paratroopers who arrived a little bit later, they managed to prevent a very large number of terrorists from infiltrating into the community. And what's very interesting with the Alumim investigation is that the community essentially wasn't infiltrated by the terrorists. The residential area of the community wasn't infiltrated by the terrorists. So we had 100 terrorists reaching Alumim, and what happened is during the fighting, the terrorists managed to breach the back entrance of the community initially, and then they drove through Alumim and reached the main entrance on Route 232, and over there at that point in the morning, it was around 7:10, 7:15 a.m. Many partygoers from the Nova Festival had fled to that area. And at the entrance to the community, literally right on the fence, and at the Alumim junction where there was a bomb shelter, the terrorists massacred many of the partygoers, more than 20 at that point. There was a police officer that was there. He shot back. The terrorists then fled back through the community and back out the back entrance. So the main massacre site was actually not inside Alumim. It was outside the community at the junction.
In addition to the foreign workers who were killed.
Exactly. So later that morning, another group of terrorists infiltrated through the back, and they didn't head for the residential area of Alumim, but rather to the industrial and agricultural area. And that's where basically this big group of terrorists first entered. The local security team battled them. And while they were exchanging fire with this relatively large group of terrorists, some of them basically flanked the local security team and headed for the industrial area where the foreign workers' residences are. We're talking about nationals from Thailand and Nepal who were agricultural students, and they gathered them up and murdered 22 of them there. And that was the second massacre site during this attack. So what we can see is that the local security team and the troops that arrived at the entrance to the community later prevented additional terrorists from actually infiltrating into the community, but dozens were murdered outside of the town, outside the community, at the entrance and in the industrial area. So the bottom line is that the probe says that the IDF failed in its mission to protect those in Alumim, but the outcome for the residents of Alumim was something that was a bit of a silver lining in all that happened on October 7th, is that the actual community was relatively spared from Hamas's attack. Of course, the foreign workers who were there are also part of the community. They're living there, so can't forget that they were also killed, but the actual community itself did not come under attack. There were also 2 cases of civilians being killed by mistaken identity during this attack. The first case was one of these civilians who survived the initial massacre at the entrance to the community at the bomb shelter, one who fled from the Nova Festival. His name is Ofek Atun, and he and his girlfriend Tamar entered the community after this massacre, after surviving it. They went into a home of an elderly couple. They basically broke into their home to try and shelter there. They didn't realize anybody was home. The elderly couple were in their bomb shelter, and they thought terrorists had infiltrated into their home. They called on the local security team, and they arrived. They surrounded the home, and during all of this confusion, Ofek was killed by one of the local security officers, and Tamar was shot and wounded. And that was one case of a mistaken identity. They believed that he was a terrorist that had infiltrated into the home. And then later in the evening, there was apparently a Thai national who came from another community, tried to climb over the fence into Alumim. He was shot and killed, but until now, Israel does not know his identity. There's been many efforts to check this. There's been officials have checked with Thailand. They've taken DNA tests. They still don't know who this man is.
Let's turn to Nir Oz, which is one of the most blatant failures of the IDF on October 7th. Among the chaos, unlike other Israeli border communities attacked on October 7th, the IDF did not fight any terrorists in Nir Oz, and it's a community of about 420 residents, 386 of which were there during the onslaught. In all, 47 people, including 41 residents and 6 partygoers fleeing the nearby rave, were killed at the kibbutz during the onslaught. Another 76 were abducted by the terrorists, 67 alive and 9 who were killed that day, either in Nir Oz or en route to the Gaza Strip. Of the over 500 terrorists who invaded Nir Oz, the investigative team has only been able to find the body of 1 in the kibbutz. The forces did not reach the kibbutz in time, and out of 100 houses on the kibbutz, only 6 were not touched by the terrorists. The former Chief of Staff, Herzi Halevi, has used Nir Oz as the archetype in the failures of October 7th, and he has vowed that it will remain in the minds of every soldier entering the army. Manny, what can you tell us about this wide-scale failure?
What happened at Nir Oz is really just, it's so different to what we just talked about with Alumim. With Alumim, they didn't touch any of the homes and troops were there and they fought against the terrorists and prevented infiltration. Here, the army wasn't there at all. The first troops to arrive at Nir Oz did so 40 minutes after the last terrorist left. 500 terrorists, which is an extraordinary number compared to other towns that were attacked on October 7th. It's an unusual amount to attack one community. There's more terrorists attacked Nir Oz than there are residents there. That's why essentially every home was touched there, apart from 6. The team found that the reason why so many terrorists reached Nir Oz, and I'll get into why the IDF failed to stop them and why troops didn't arrive there yet, but the reason why so many terrorists reached Nir Oz was there was a lack of IDF troops defending that area. When the Hamas invasion began, and there were 114 breaches in the fence, troops were focused in all sorts of areas, but Nir Oz became a little bit of I would say, a blind spot almost for the army. Additionally, there was a tank that was disabled by Hamas on the border. The infamous tank where 4 troops were abducted from, 3 of whom have been confirmed dead. And this tank became a sort of attraction on October 7th. So many hundreds of Hamas terrorists and Palestinians reached this tank on the border during the attack. They came from the Khan Yunis suburb of Houthi, which is very close to the border. And from there, all they needed to do was look through this big hole in the fence a few hundred meters and they would see Nir Oz. So many of them just continued into Nir Oz. There was an AP photographer, or a photographer who was doing freelancing work for AP, who also went into Nir Oz, and we have pictures of him there walking around. The reason why the army failed to stop the terrorists from invading Nir Oz is because there was no accurate picture of what was happening. Troops were fighting all over the place at their own army posts in other communities. They didn't understand what was going on in Nir Oz, and even if they had, it would have been, there were so many other things happening at the same time. If they would have had some sort of alert, if they would have tried to, troops were sent there earlier, there could have been maybe, the amount of harm could have been reduced, the amount of civilians abducted and killed could have been reduced, but the troops were just trying to fight everywhere, and Hamas completely overran them at that point. There was no command and control. There was no accurate picture of what was happening. And a big problem that they found was that no troops, no commanders or anything spoke to anybody in Nir Oz during the attack. And people in Nir Oz were calling for help, according to the probe. They were calling the police. They were trying to speak to the army, but this wasn't connecting, and nobody was really understanding what was happening. And a big reason why even we saw in other communities that many troops reached communities on their own accord. So they didn't know where they were going to, but they just ended up reaching communities, even in Alumim, up until the paratroopers in Alumim. All the troops that arrived there were sort of almost randomly. They were just reaching there. And because of this randomness of where troops were reaching to, they didn't reach Nir Oz. Nir Oz is sort of geographically in a bit of a weird spot. It's quite south on Route 232, which is the sort of the north-south road that runs along the Gaza border. And many forces that were arriving from the north to the south to reach Gaza ended up in Sderot, because that's the northernmost city. And it had a lot of attention in Sderot. There was a lot of footage going around, and troops basically got stuck fighting in Sderot, almost like a sort of a traffic jam, where all the soldiers basically got stuck fighting there, and they didn't push further south. And those who did push further south got stuck either fighting in those communities along the way, like Alumim or Nahal Oz. And at the junctions, Hamas had set up ambushes. They were waiting for the troops, and Nir Oz is sort of much further down, but nobody could reach it in time. There was troops who managed to breach through the Ma'on junction at around 11:45, which is very close to Nir Oz, But by that point, the last Hamas terrorists were on their way out. The abductions had already completed, and that force didn't even reach Nir Oz anyway, because it was instructed to head to another town, because there was no real direction. So very few troops were actually explicitly instructed to head for Nir Oz, and those who did basically got stuck fighting on the way. Even those who were heading from the south, and very few troops were heading from the south, because geographically there isn't that many bases or communities further south, but they also got stuck at the at all the junctions and in other communities while fighting on the way. The army says that the probe finds that this is not a sort of a tactical failure or a moral failure by the troops. The troops weren't afraid to go fight or anything. They didn't fail to navigate there, but there was no command and control. There was no one to tell them the situation in Nir Oz is very serious and troops need to reach there now. There was no prioritization there. Nobody in the army at the time understood what was happening in Nir Oz. There was so many communities under attack, and it became sort of a blind spot for the army that day. And even the random troops who could have maybe arrived there, who were close, were stuck fighting in other communities and were just unable to get there. And that's why by the time forces did get there, the terrorists had already gone, the abductions had completed, the murders had completed, and it really sort of underlines the failures of the IDF that day during the battles.
So these probes are only as good as the follow-through to the recommendations of them, meaning it is important to figure out what happened on the day, but it's also extremely important to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And according to what you've written about this Nir Oz probe, one of the recommendations is setting up an additional IDF base between Nir Oz and the Gaza Strip. And are you seeing any signs that this is going to happen?
I think it will happen. It's a recommendation by the investigation team, so they don't have much of a say. And it's up to the new chief of staff and the IDF's planning division to decide whether or not this happens. And I'll correct you and say that they recommend establishing an IDF post, not a base. As we've seen, bases are relatively difficult to defend, like the Nahal Oz base. There was another base next to Nir Oz as well that also came under attack and was captured by Hamas and the troops that were unable to go and defend Nir Oz. So the army probe recommends establishing an IDF post between Nir Oz and Gaza in order to actually defend Nir Oz in the event of an attack. A post is something that's defendable rather than a base, which is more open and can, as we've seen, come under attack and easily be captured.
Manny, thank you as usual for all of these updates and insights.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.